Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Real Science Exchange, the pubcast where leading scientists and industry professionals meet over a few drinks to discuss the latest ideas and trends in animal nutrition. We're just coming off a successful Real Science lecture series of 5 webinars where we preview the new 2021 Dairy NRC a chapter at a time. And we're looking forward to having these sit-down conversations with each of our presenters and their guests. Hi, I'm Scott Sorrell, one of your hosts at the Real Science Exchange. Tonight, we have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Lou Armentano. Lou tackled the fats and energy sections of the new Dairy NRC for us during our webinar series. Dr. Armentano, welcome to the Exchange.
Glad to be here.
Lou, before we dive into the meat of the fats and energy section, tell us what's in your glass.
Oh, I have, because my scotch is apparently on a FedEx truck, okay, which is probably weaving down the road. But this is a local brew. It's a Fantasy Factory. It's a IPA, and it's made here in Madison. In fact, Hopalicious, which is Ale Asylum beer, this is made in their Hopalicious expanded, and they made a new brewery, and this is made in their old brewery. So this is not made by Ale Asylum. It's called Fantasy Factory. It's awesome. It's got a picture of a cat with a 50 caliber pistols riding on a unicorn with flames coming out. It's an awesome beer. Mike, you've never had this, I think, but it's quite good.
I will definitely put that one on my my short list.
Silent for sure.
Yeah.
If you like IPAs.
I love IPAs. Lou, it's been 20 years since the last NRC, and now I guess it's called the NASEM, N-A-S-E-M. Can you tell us a little bit about the process that was employed in developing the energy and fats section of the new Dairy NRC?
Well, we did meet as a group. We were assigned individual chapters. I did the fat chapter, and I guess I can say was a co-author on a couple other chapters. I actually was not a co-author on the energy chapter, but so we got together and we got our assignments, and then we would do our work on our own, and then we would come back and say what we did and put our ideas before the rest of the committee. And then you begin piecing the whole thing together because it's all integrated, right? So the protein model had to have energy estimates in it, and those energy estimates had to be the final ones, right? So when they're developing everything in this NRC is based on some sort of meta-regression analysis. To an extreme, it was done somewhat in the last NRC, but to an extreme that's at least an order of magnitude more. Pretty much every chapter had some sort of regression analysis behind it, I think. And in order to do the protein, they had to have the energy values. And in order to have the energy values, Mike had to have some estimate of fatty acid digestibility, and he also had to have information from the carbohydrate chapter. So all this stuff is integrated, and sort of at the end, the protein sort of came at the end because it had to. So really the opportunity to go back and change anything was pretty minimal too. So it did take a long time. It is integrated, but it's quite the process. I should say from an energy point of view, when you introduce Mike, this will be important. Mike was the lead on a USDA grant where we were trying to work on breeding values for improving feed efficiency in cattle. And Mike and I and Rob Templeman and Kent Weigel, and I'm going to forget Wendy's name, my gosh. But 5 of us got together, and a gentleman from Holland, we got together and we did this grant. So during that process, Mike and I really did a lot of talking about energy balance. And it became really obvious that the last NRC was very confusing in terms of dealing with body weights, changes in body energy. It was just really hard to work with, right? And I think Mike really got inspired there to help make the new system simpler. So Mike and I actually know each other in grad school, so we go back a long way. So we've talked a lot about energy during this process.
Well, I see you brought Mike along with you as a guest tonight. Why don't you go ahead and introduce him?
Well, Mike Vandehaar really doesn't need any introduction. He was blessed by being in graduate school as a young graduate student when I was a senior graduate student. So he had somebody to look up to, and I'm sure he still admires me as his hero. And
Yeah, I hope so.
Faculty member at Michigan State. Everybody knows Mike is author of Spartan, a lot of practical experience in energy and also in heifer growth. So both areas that needed serious attention from the last NRC.
Yeah, so thank you for that. Thanks for joining us tonight, Mike. First, tell us what you're drinking, and then what did you find most interesting or perhaps most challenging about being the lead author on the energy chapter?
Okay, well, I am drinking a beer from Michigan called, from Short's Brewery, called Humalupalicious. And it is the best IPA I've ever had. It is my go-to. I'd love to challenge you with this one, Lou, because I've never had anything from Wisconsin close to as good as a Michigan IPA.
Not even Spotted Cow?
Oh, gosh. I love the name. Unfortunately, it just doesn't meet up what it's up to with the name. What I found interesting or challenging was, first off, as Lou said, I've been interested in energy a long time. I've been, when the first NRC, well, back in the, not the first, the 89 was what, the 6th edition? I poured through that thing as I tried to make sense of how to put it into a model that could be practically used on farms called Spartan. And then when 2001 came out, I was frustrated by many of the things in there that were hard to implement in a model you would use on a farm. And some of them were hard to even figure out what the equation should be. Things didn't always match. But now I understand, it's a huge job. I realize that we started this in 2014, didn't we? I think so. So
2014, right.
I realize I've been 1/4 of my academic career, I've been working on NRC. Smokes. And that was
And this
one. I was a reviewer for the 2001, and there were a lot of things that I liked about it and things that I found frustrating. And so when I got asked if I was interested to do this one, I jumped on the chance because I thought there's some things we can do better. And so I found it really fun. I mean, I love working with Lou, Mike Gallen, Bill Weiss, Rich Erdman. We have just a bunch of people on our committee that are some of my favorite people to see when I go to meetings. So, I really enjoyed the chance to work on this with them. There were frustrations, lack of data here and there, but overall it was a rewarding experience, and I feel pretty good about the product we came out with.
Excellent. Looking forward to the conversation tonight. Tonight, we're also welcoming back one of our special co-hosts. That'd be Dr. Glen Aines. Dr. Aines, welcome back.
Thank you, Scott. Good to be here again.
So I know you're chomping at the bit on this one. We've been talking about some of the questions you wanted to go over. But first things first, what's in your glass tonight?
Tonight, I'm drinking a rum and Coke. This is a Cape Coral, Florida. I love the name, the Wicked Dolphin. So yeah, it's quite a nice one for local.
Good. Well, tonight I'm drinking a Macallan 12. So I'm going with the Scotch. And I understand, Mike, that's actually, you ordered a Scotch as well, or one of you did.
I did.
And it hasn't made it yet.
Like Lou, mine is on a UPS truck.
So I'm having my Macallan tonight. Kind of the backstory of that is in honor of a couple friends. That'd be Dr. Steve Puntney and Dr. Neil Forsberg. We had the opportunity to drink Macallan, a much older one and much more expensive one. And as I recall, we've run up some pretty large tabs with that. And I'm also honoring Dr. Neil Forsberg tonight because he wrote a book. It's called Climbing Kilimanjaro, Escaping the Metaphorical Couch. And so it's available on Amazon. That's where I got mine. It's a very interesting read, especially if you know Neil. And if you don't know Neil, recommend meeting him sometime. He's a great gentleman and a good friend. So with that, why don't we get started? Mike, can you summarize the biggest challenges in the fats and energy sections from the 2001 edition as it compares to the one that's coming out?
So I'll just say the things that we really wanted to fix with the 2001 version was, for one, the discount factor was very difficult to make sense of, and the discount applied to the whole diet, digested energy, value. In the text, they talk about that that you use a fat-corrected TDN value to adjust with increasing levels of intake, to adjust or depress the DE value of a feed, of a diet. In the actual program, they didn't do the fat correction. In Spartan, I did it the way the text said to do it, not the way the program did it. And but it was pretty clear that it depressed digestibility too much at high levels of intake. And what was also kind of frustrating is that at high levels of intake, if you were trying to use this as a formulation program, and you put in that you had a diet that was mostly forage, once you got to a 4 times maintenance intake, it didn't matter if your diet was mostly forage or half grain, half forage, because once you had a higher TDN value of the diet, intake was depressed much faster. Now, of course, cows couldn't eat at 4 times maintenance intake, but the program, as a formulation program, didn't know that. So when I would try to...
Mike, you said intake was depressed. You mean digestibility was depressed?
Yeah, I'm sorry, digestibility depression. But when you try to teach students about balancing diets, they don't always have the practical experience to realize that, okay, well, a cow's not going to eat enough energy if she's fed an all hay diet, right? So how the digestibility depression worked was just kind of frustrating and hard to implement. The other one was that there were some simple things like protein was overvalued in the 2001 system. In the 1989 system, we put everything on it like a TDN value. So protein and starch had the same energy value. But in the 2001 system, protein had an energy value that was almost 20% higher than starch, because when you look at the IMI value of protein, or if you go to the grocery store and you look at protein and carbs, they're both about 4 kcals per gram in the grocery store label, right? And that's because if you use protein for maintenance, you have to get rid of the amino group as urinary nitrogen, which takes away 20% of the energy because we can't oxidize that amino group and get any ATP from it. Well, the 1989 system didn't give protein any value other than if it was at maintenance. The 2001 system went completely the other way and said that protein is worth a lot more than starch. So as a formulation program, if you wanted to meet the energy requirement of a high-producing cow, one way you could do it with 2001 was feed them a really high protein diet, because protein was worth more than starch. So we corrected for that. So I was happy. We had working with Ermias Krebab, we put in a correction so that when you go from DE, you subtract out your expected urinary energy loss, you subtract out your expected methane loss, and you get IMI for the diet. I think those are both, are they perfect? Will we improve on that in the future? For sure. But we at least have a framework now that can be built upon with better numbers in the future. This is the way biology works. And the old systems didn't really work the way biology did. I'm sure there's something else that'll come to mind, but those are a few that I was thinking about.
From my perspective, I'd like to make 2 comments on maybe 3 comments on big changes in the energy chapter. One is that, and using a lot of data from the USDA and also existing published data, I believe, the cows have changed. So the maintenance requirement for cows has changed. It hasn't changed because we started figuring out a different way. It changed because the cows have biologically changed, with genetic selection of cows for being more potential for milk production and more dairy-like. Those cows just use more energy just to maintain themselves. So that's a big change. And probably, I think Mike gets defensive about making the change from 0.08 to 0.1, but probably should have been more. Because it's still changing. Yeah. It's still changing. So that's one big thing.
Can I comment on that before you go on?
Sure.
Oh, wait,
No,
or will
I
you
expect
forget?
it, yeah.
So, yeah, Lou is exactly right on that. Because, but what's interesting is our point one came from a reevaluation of the Beltsville data, and the point one was for the data from the mid 1970s to about 1990s, and that's what 25 years ago. And in our feed efficiency project, Rob Templeman's analysis of trying to understand what are the things that influence dry matter intake in high producing modern cows from the last 10 years or even 5 years, it looks like the maintenance requirement is higher than 0.1. Perhaps we should have done that. Yeah, we just weren't sure we were ready to.
It's everywhere throughout something like this. You know, we say it needs to be data based, right? Well, the data is all in the past, right? And here's one place where maybe we could have. I'm not criticizing what Mike did. You have to justify what you did. The number has to come from somewhere. But it's one of those places where maybe we should have skated to where the puck was going to be instead of where it's been, right? But when you base things on data, you're automatically looking back. I want to say a couple of things about the energy adjustments. So one of the things that became very confusing, so reading the energy chapter and trying to integrate the fat part into the old energy chapter in the NRC 7, it literally gave me a headache every time I read it, okay? And I'm sure I've read that more than anybody else on the earth. And I'm still confused, okay? Because I think there are things in there that it says it does one thing and it does another, but it's just very, very confusing. And there's all sorts of little exceptions for fat that drive you nuts. It's just impossible to understand. It really is. I think if I can't understand it, nobody can. Maybe somebody can, but I can't. So I'm glad it changed because now I don't have to understand it anymore, okay? New one's much simpler. The other thing is that one of the things about fat in particular, but with every nutrient, the DE to ME conversion was done on a nutrient basis, okay? In the current NRC 8, we get the DE, we adjust the DE for intake. There's still an intake effect that reduces digestibility. It's just smaller than it was before because it was too big before. And then the DE to ME is based on the amount of nitrogen and methane that's going to be produced by that diet, okay? And so it's a holistic, integrated evaluation of the diet, not the nutrients themselves. And that's an important distinction because actually for fat, it's very important because in fact, fat has associative effects where it decreases methane production. So it actually has an associative effect that increases the DE to ME conversion for all the nutrients in the feed, right? So it actually, in the old NRC, the fat DE to ME was 100%. Now it's actually more than 100%, if you will, which is kind of hard for people to grasp. Yeah. The other thing I want to say is one more point that people may not quite get. In addition to simplifying the whole idea, I mean, intake now is expressed as a percent of body weight, not as a multiple of maintenance, okay? And that makes it way easier, and I'm sure no less accurate to do it that way, okay? It's just simpler, okay? The other, and the degree of depression has been reduced. It only reduces carbohydrate, right? Fiber and starch, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Digestibility. It doesn't affect fat digestibility or protein digestibility, right? So, and the other thing that's different, so the depression is less, it's limited to certain nutrients, but a really important thing is that what is considered the baseline is no longer maintenance, okay? The baseline is now a cow eating 3.5% of body weight. So that's a lactating cow that's producing, a reasonable amount of milk, okay? So when you look at the adjustment, from that cow to a really high producing cow in the herd, it's not nearly as big of an adjustment, okay? And that's partly because the depression is less, but also the base is much higher than it was before. So it'd be easy for people to get confused. In some places it's not going to adjust at all. While the depression is still there, it's just built into the baseline 3.5x. You actually can get elevation if you have a lower producing cow. The digestibility will actually go up from base if she's eating less than 3.5%.
And if she's eating a low starch diet,
or low starch
diet, definitely see that, yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think those are important differences that are, people just need to realize it's doing that. But the whole thing, it's so funny. When I was going over this and reading the energy chapter, it just doesn't give me a headache, and that's worth a lot, right? If it's more accurate, great. If it's easier to understand, that's great too. So
But you now drink higher quality alcohol. Is that part of it?
yeah, but
I mean,
at the level I drink, it doesn't matter. Okay.
The relative importance
So
of methane in these equations, where does the data from the literature come on?
Yeah, good question.
That was Ermias. Yeah, Ermias had a paper. Well, he was on the paper, and he had and they had an equation that was based on amount of fat in a number of factors, but fat influenced NDF digestibility, predictors of methane, and NDF was in there. And one thing that we did do is he went back because I thought, why don't you have digestible NDF? That's what matters here. Is not if NDF isn't digested, we don't care. It doesn't affect methane, or it shouldn't. And he went back and put in digestible NDF. Sometimes I don't know how accurate all of their values were for digested NDF, but that equation did a pretty good job of predicting methane. And I heard Lou's talk from last week, and probably it's possible some fatty acids do more than others. That's not in that equation. So there's room for improvement, but I think we have the basis for a good system to move forward on. So
from my perspective, and actually I think Mike's too, we kind of thought, the last NRC was fairly favorable to fat, right? So we definitely didn't go in there trying to make it better. I didn't anyway. Right?
I didn't either.
We had made this decision early on that the D to ME would be done at the diet level. So I actually had nothing to do with I'm not questioning the final equation aspect, but I had actually nothing to do with the methane equation. Okay, the selection of it, and didn't know fat was going to reduce methane that much until the other committee members came back and reported on it. So it's very interesting using all this meta-analysis to drive this. Makes sense, right? Because these are diets that people have fed and recorded. Now, they're not the average of all diets fed in the world, and not the average of all diets fed in the U.S. They're just the diets where people happen to measure methane production and also, measure these inputs. So I was a little nervous, because you pick out the best equation, and maybe the first equation. So I think the final equation's got dry matter intake in it. It's got digestible NDF in it, but of course, NDF does make a difference, right? Because it's part of the dry matter intake, right? And then it's got fat. And I thought, what if like the next best equation, which is like almost as good, right, doesn't have fat in it? Okay, but when Ermias presented this, the top 5 methane producing equations had fat in them. So, there's really no reason to pick any other equation. They're all going to have fat, and all with a negative effect on methane. But it wasn't necessarily from a database that was just to determine the effect of fat on methane, right? It was from a broader database because we needed one equation that would estimate methane from all the dietary inputs. And it's one of the things that happens. I mean, we have the intake equation. We're not doing the intake chapter right now, but the intake, the NRC predicts an intake based on diet, okay? As one based on cow and then a new one that's based on diet. And Mike Allen put that equation together, and when he did, fat did not show up in that equation, all right? So he looked for all the things in the diet that affected intake, and fat didn't. When you're looking for what overall as a diet explains things, you have to realize things in the diet are correlated, so you don't want to put a lot of correlated independent variables in an equation. Well, both Mike Allen and I, when we did searches in the literature where people fed fat, that was the nature of the experiment, we did find a reduction in intake. So those are two different questions, right? I mean, one is sort of limiting itself a little bit to cause and effect equations where you fed fat, but then of course we didn't look at all the other things that were changing in those diets, right? But then if you look for predicting intake overall, fat didn't make the grade compared to other things in the diet that were more important and presumably were correlated with fat. So same thing happened with methane. I mean, the methane production, we have one methane production equation that affects the energy chapter, it affects fat energy values, it affects environmental issues, and it's the best one we could come up for. And fat is not in there by a fluke, okay? If the top 5 equations include fat, it belongs in there. Now, whether we have exactly the right number, whether it reflects all fats, equally, it's a good question.
Like Lou said, I'm not a proponent. In the past, I've not been a big proponent of adding fat to every dairy cow's diet. One of the things that, yes, the model is integrated, but on the one hand, so it's integrated, but to some extent, we haven't seen how all of it fits together until just recently when the software was really developed. So up until that point, I assumed fat was going to increase the energy density of a diet, not just because it has a higher energy density itself, but because of its effect on decreasing methane. But now that everything's together, we see that, and part of me was thinking, oh gosh, I didn't mean to put together a model that did that, but that's what it is. And the only thing I would add to that is, both Mike Allen has had a nice publication from 2001 that showed that fat can reduce intake. In this latest paper that we did on looking at dietary factors that can affect that to predict intake, one of the things that was difficult about that paper was that what we feed cows is highly correlated with how much milk they produce. So the diets in that model, milk production is important for predicting intake. So he had to come up with some complicated, advanced statistical techniques to try to make sense of how do you deal with the fact that we have cows fed that are producing a lot of milk are fed different types of diets than the cows that are not producing much milk. And I would advise people to read the paper, Souza et al. I think Malin's the author. He's the first author. So Mike's the first author on that paper. I'd advise him to read that, but it's a nice paper. It does the best job of any equation yet at predicting intake based off diet and animal factors, but it's not perfect. And we know that high fat diets can depress intake sometimes. So when people use the model, they just need to be aware that, okay, remember, fat can depress intake. This model doesn't show that in that intake prediction. So don't just do the thing that looks best to the computer. Use your head.
So far, gentlemen, we've just been talking about fat as an energy source, and Balchem lumped the fat and energy sections together just because we wanted to limit this to 5 webinars in the series. But we know that fatty acids are much more than energy, or can be. They're very biologically active compounds, and I'm thinking back to some research done by one of your colleagues, Dr. Vandehaar, Adam Locke. How did you guys account for that, or did you account for some of those issues in the NRC?
Thing about partitioning and how some fatty acids can alter partitioning, we did not even attempt. We talk about it in the energy chapter, but we did not attempt to model that. That's something I hope that we can do a better job of in the future. We know that starch can affect partitioning of nutrients between, say, body repletion and milk production, but we did not attempt to include that. Yeah, Lou?
So we had done a literature review that's hidden in an Australian nutrition journal, but that looked at different fatty acids. So one thing that's definitely in the new NRC is we switched from ether extract to fatty acid. And so when we did that, we are actually reporting the fatty acid content of the feeds. And we do that because we think it's important, okay? The the crunching number part of the model just talks about total fatty acid digestion, and it does not in any way, if you change the oleic to linolenic, the result of the model is not going to change. Okay. However, the chapter talks quite a bit about how those fatty acids do affect milk fat. And, the bottom line of the story is that whenever you feed C18 fatty acids, in generally, there's not a lot of feeding of C18-0. So when you feed C18-1, C18-2, C18-3, what always happens is that the milk C18 yield, okay, goes up, but the milk short chain fatty acids that are made in the mammary gland goes down, okay? And that effect is clearly bigger for linoleic acid, okay? And as a matter of fact, you can feed so much linoleic acid that you actually start reducing milk C18 yield. So it's sort of a curvilinear response. So that's discussed in the chapter. There's a report that shows you the fatty acid levels in the chapter. And, by all means, if you run this model, right, and then the cows do something different, right, the cows are wrong, okay, guaranteed, right? Or your diet's not really what you said it is. No, it's not, the model's wrong, okay? But if the model's not predicting something, there's got to be a reason for that, okay? And so that's when you need to use your brain, and you need to look at the intakes the cows are actually doing. You need to look at, is my linoleic acid content in this diet too high? Okay. Maybe it's too low. It's an essential fatty acid, right? So those outputs are there. They're fairly prominent, and people, and they are fairly accurate now because we have, actual measurements of fatty acid. And to measure total fatty acid, you measure the individual fatty acids and add them up. So the individual fatty acid data is there. People should react to it, but the model's not going to do it for them. Another thing that's also very useful in that respect is that you can now get from DHI, you can actually get a profile of the de novo, the C16, and the C18 fatty acids in milk. And that's very informative about what's going on. Because what's happening most of the time when you add oils is that the C18 in milk is going up and the shorter fatty acids are going down. And if you look at total fat, you would say nothing's happening, okay? But something is definitely happening almost all the time. And that's, again, discussed at length in the chapter, but there's not a single numerical equation in there that would do it in the model. So you have to use this. Has anybody noticed that Mike Vandehaar, the Dutch guy, talks with his hands all the time, and Lou Armentano, the Italian guy, doesn't? I've just heard it.
Hey, Glenn, I was going to ask you, you listened to Dr. Armentano's presentation. What was maybe the key takeaway that you came away with, key learning from that? And then what's a couple things that maybe weren't answered for you?
I think probably the fatty acid conversation was probably one of the most interesting parts of it, quite frankly. You have a situation where essentially fatty acids are not depressing digestibility, correct, Lou?
Fatty acids are not depressing NDF digestibility. And
Right.
that's not really a change in anything. That was just sort of overblown in a couple reviews.
Right.
The fatty acids that depress NDF digestibility are like C14, okay, which also causes cows to crash miserably, or at least in U.S. diets. So,
but I think that the challenge for the nutritionist is going to be, as you say, maybe using the noggin a little bit, because if the model doesn't tell them if you feed too much fat, I mean, conventional wisdom used to be 6-7% would kind of be your upper limit, because everybody was concerned about depressing dry matter intake and whatnot. That some people are going to look at the model and make bad decisions, right?
we did leave 7% in the chapter as sort of a recommended upper
Okay, so
limit.
that was actually one of my questions.
Yeah.
Is there still some guidance in the system?
Yeah, so I mean, we actually left 7% in as an upper limit.
Okay.
It's rarely economical, to be quite honest, I think it's really economical to go to that level. Okay, most people do that because they perceive a reproductive benefit, which may or may not be there. That I certainly can't come to any conclusion about that. But you also have to realize that the data set So there was, I should say there was a slight depression of NDF digestibility. Okay, I think there was 1 unit of depression for each unit of fatty acid that was added. Okay, so it's not none, and that was for I think free oil. Palmitic acid, for example, increases digestibility, which is very interesting, right? And you have to realize that scientists I think are very conservative. Okay, when I do an experiment, I like to hit it with a hammer. So I'll go for some real negative controls and some. I want to see a difference, okay? And then I want to look at the treatments in between the negative and positive control that are different. Scientists are pretty conservative, so there's just not a hell of a lot of data out there where people are feeding more than 7% fatty acid, right? Because they've all been told not to. With a linear effect, if you go much beyond that, then it may be a problem, right? But it's not really it's not like a cutoff, like a cliff. And I think that's what's very confusing about the fat things. People want to still think of it as a ramp, right? Well, this depression in short chain fatty acids starts right away, okay? As soon as you start C18 to a diet, you can get a diet as low in fat as you possibly can, which means taking out corn, right, which is 5% fatty acid, and putting in cornstarch, which is no fatty acid, right? You can do that. You can get a diet down to about 1.5% fatty acid. It's hard, okay? When you add C18 to that diet, C18 goes up, right? You have very low levels of C18 in the diet. You feed exogenous C18, it goes up, but the short chain fatty acids go down, okay? Right away. So it's a balance of those two streams, but they're both pretty darn linear across the range. So I don't know if I cut your question off, but that was.
No, that's perfect.
And I would just point out too that if you use the 2001 model, you could do the same thing. So, right, you could have added extra fat. There was no maximum upper limit that it would prevent you from trying to feed.
Right.
So the software is no different this time. It will let you do stupid stuff.
I understand that. The other thing that I was going to ask you guys about was, if I remember and I interpret it right, in the presentation you talked about that there's now an impact of frame growth on, I assume it's on, and I might have gotten it wrong, on lactation, milk production.
So
Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, in the previous NRC, they talk about this in the chapter, okay, that a primiparous cow could have both frame growth, which is true structural growth of the animal, muscle, bone, everything, including some fat, including some gut tissues, including even some gut fill. That happens in a primiparous animal, as well as you can have reserve repletion, which happens in all cows, even when they hit maturity. They talk about that in the chapter. In Spartan, I did what the chapter said, but I guess I didn't even know this. Lou filled me in on this, that if you use the model that came along, the disc that came along with the 2001, it did not let you put in any frame growth for a 2-year-old.
Well, you put it in, but you said
it didn't do anything.
You said how big she was, and you said how big she was going to be when she was older. But if you change that gap, nothing changed in the program. I mean, I don't, we do experimental diets and we use heifers, but we don't formulate different diets for the heifers and the cows, right, when we do an experiment. So I never really specially formulated diets for heifers. So I didn't know that for the longest time. And then I decided, I think probably when we started doing the speed efficiencies, I don't even know when, but I just decided to change those maybe for a class. And I noticed it didn't matter if the heifer wasn't full grown or not in the computer part of the NRC model. It just didn't matter. So that was just an oversight, I think. But, we have to realize that this frame growth is important, right? I mean, even I think it came out of a study, a multi-university study, and even in third lactation, most of these cows are not quite their full mature weight, okay? Yeah. And 40% of our cows might be first lactation animals, okay? Right. So they have a significant growth left. They're still growing in second lactation, and a little bit, they're still, it's not much, but they're growing in third lactation. So, I compare a third lactation cow as more like a, 18 or 19-year-old. Their major growth is done, but they're still growing a little bit. So most of our cows, still have some frame growth left, right? Yeah. Fourth lactation cows are going to be a little bit rare around here for some reason. So I'm going to pat Mike on the back if he's not waving his arms too much. most of the terminology, shrunk weight, empty weight, there were so many terms in there that just didn't need to be in there, right? And it had just gotten copied over from the beef model as the simplest way to do it. That's not unreasonable, right? For dairy guys to turn to the beef people for growth. But it was just, their system's a little different, and it was just so needlessly complicated that, and then there's separating out this change in frame growth from gain. It's much better, Mike. You've done a great job. Now you can take credit for it and say exactly what you did, but it was.
Thanks. I just want to make one point about it, though, and that is that because of the different because reserve repletion is the energy density of reserve repletion is much higher than the energy density of frame growth, probably about twice as high. But the efficiency of converting ME to the retained energy of reserve repletion is also about twice as high as the efficiency of converting ME to the actual retained energy of frame growth. So in the end, if the animal's gaining weight, it takes about 6 megacals of net energy for lactation to gain a kilogram, regardless of whether it's true frame or reserves. What is different is that the frame growth requires more protein, requires almost twice as much protein.
Yeah, the question, I guess, ultimately comes to the practical application. If you've got most of the average cow is what, 2.6, 2.8 lactations in a herd. The vast majority of your herd is physiologically immature.
Yes, right.
And then how should, a
So if you have
nutritionist be looking at it?
If you have the ability to do a 2-year-old group, you should do a 2-year-old group. And now the program will support that those animals ought to be fed a higher protein diet.
Pretty high percentage of your herd is going to be first and second lactation.
Yeah,
So,
I think second lactation, yes, they're still growing, but it is relative to their total requirement. It's not, I don't know what the energy bit would be, but it's maybe 10%. So in the end, it probably, you could just have all of your lactation 2 and older fed the same diet, but it would promote the idea that we really ought to have a 2-year-old group.
So college professors love to think of all the different groups of cows we could feed. And then nutritionists, at least the ones in Wisconsin, their motto seems to be, well, if we only make one diet, we can't possibly get it to the wrong pen. Okay. So there's a lot of one TMR, okay, that's made. And then grouping animals, if you try to group animals in a rotary parlor and try to find the cow, she's in the wrong pen. I mean, it's a nightmare. But we did some, Victor
Cabrera,
thank you, did a field survey of how animals are grouped, right? And the 2 most common grouping strategies is a post-fresh group, okay, and a first lactation group. So that first lactation group is actually grouped, okay? They're actually physically separated, all right? So maybe now if we came up with different protein levels for that group, they actually might feed a different diet to that group. It's not that they can't. It's not that they're going to have to group them on purpose. There's an awful lot of first lactation groups because, people can see they're smaller, right? They might have, I know in our barn, we actually have some smaller stalls, a little bit shorter stalls that we put the first lactation animals in, and they stay a little cleaner, being an appropriate size stall. And they're not around, bigger cows that can beat them up when we have all Holsteins, right? If we have Jerseys, then the Jerseys beat up the Holsteins. But with the heifers and the cows, they're kept separate, so they could be fed separately. But it is sometimes it's like trying to push a wet noodle uphill to get people to feed multiple diets. You're grinning, so I assume you've seen this. Yourself.
Been there, done that.
But a lot of opportunities for this post-fresh group. They're kept separate for management, and that's a place where you can, focus on putting fairly expensive ingredients that, as long as they're not going to be in the diet for, 300 days, are well worth the risk, right? In that early post-fresh group. And then the heifers could easily be treated differently.
How long would they be in that post-fresh group, Lou, ideally? You've got a magic wand.
Glenn, you probably have a better idea than I do. I think the numbers, set with Mike putting up 3, so I assume we mean 3 weeks, 3 months. Yeah. So yeah, 30 days, and I think if a cow's doing well, she gets out. And if a cow's doing crappy, she stays in. And of course, the pen is a certain size, right? So, I mean, all these things are, if you have a whole bunch of cows calving, then it might be 2 weeks, right? For the healthiest ones. So, the flow of cows, maybe now with double off sync, we get cows pregnant in the middle of August more than we used to. I don't know. But, the flow of cows is not steady, right?
Well, there's a lot of other reasons for grouping that group.
I'm sorry?
Cows. There's a lot of other reasons for grouping those cows in the post-fresh.
Other than nutrition.
Nutritionally.
Yeah.
Can I give a good example of one?
Absolutely.
So this is when when you put into this model that you could feed a high starch diet allows for greater intake in cows, but a diet that was, say, high in soy hulls or some other high fiber byproduct feed with lower starch, actually in this model will give you almost as high of an energy density as a high starch diet, because starch depresses NDF digestibility. You feed that byproduct fiber, you no longer have as much of a depression in NDF digestibility, and the energy value of a high soy hull diet and a high starch diet could be about the same. But the high starch diet typically allows cows to eat more. So when you get to cows that are not quite as limited by gut fill in how much they eat, the model would support the idea that this is the diet you ought to include more high fiber byproduct feeds, because you get almost as much energy out of them as maybe a high starch diet. So save your high starch for the peak cows, and then if you need to, if you can find high fiber byproduct feeds cheaper, use those in your later lactation cows that have already hit their correct body condition score. And you will also, in the process, because the high fiber doesn't partition as many nutrients to body tissue, you could keep the cows from getting as fat. So I think this model we don't have that part, the partitioning part, in the model. But if you read the chapter, that idea gets promoted, and it makes a lot of sense to have another diet for cows that have hit their body condition score where you want them to be. Milk production has maybe started to tail off a little bit. Give them a high fiber diet. And by high fiber, I don't mean forage fiber necessarily, but a diet that will still promote milk.
The database really doesn't have a lot of late lactation studies in it. People do crossover studies, and we tend to want to get reasonable milk production when we're doing those studies. So we don't do a lot of crossover studies with late lactation animals, and we don't do a lot of full lactation studies. I think, I don't get out enough. But we did I was involved with some field studies, reproduction studies, and management studies. And it's surprising when BST went away, we expected to see a lot more overconditioned cows coming in, and we don't see that. So there's something going on in intake regulation, I think, and maybe it's management oriented. I don't know, but if people are feeding one group TMRs, if you just look at the calculation of how much cows are supposed to eat and then how much energy is supposed to be in the diet, some of them should be getting pretty fat, and yet they don't. So I know that Victor Cabrera was doing some energy calculations, and I said, well, your energy can't balance. And we looked at just sort of projecting the intake using the days in milk depression, which hasn't really changed a lot in this new version.
No, it's the same.
And, if you looked at how much energy density would be there for a one group DMR, if you fed that animal out to 300 some days, she should be getting fat. So something must be happening there. So the difference between partitioning of energy, there must be some sort of lipostat, that's telling the animal it's getting too fat. I apparently lack that, but cows seem to have that. So.
Yeah. Lou, you kind of touched on the fact that there is not a lot of post-fresh cow data. You guys can only build recommendations around data that you have. What's some of the biggest gaps you identified in terms of research? What What gaps do you need to fill with research? What would that be?
So you mean not post-fresh, post-peak,
Right.
right? Well, partitioning, I think, is one thing that we need to get a better handle on. And I think that we could start to, if you look at starch, especially fermentable starch, which even our intake equation doesn't have fermented starch in there, it has total starch. We just didn't have enough data to really use fermented starch well in the intake equation. But I think that by the next NRC, hopefully there will be at least the ability, if we're going to, right now we predict energy allowable milk, right? In the model, we could perhaps say, okay, here's energy allowable milk, but based on the fermented starch, maybe unsaturated fatty acids in your diet, here's what the model could predict would happen to partitioning and therefore milk yield. I think that would be an interesting thing to see if we could move toward that. Whether we won't get it right, at least not completely right in the foreseeable future.
So, one thing about, and this is the reason why transition diets have always been an issue, right? One thing about post-fresh experimentation is that it's almost got to be like a randomized type statistical trial. Okay, we do a lot of Latin square studies or some sort of switchback study, or at the very least, we do a covariate adjustment for the data. Okay, that's because identifying where that cow is in terms of production level really removes a lot of variance in milk production from the data. So that makes the trials much more powerful. And I think people think that these long-term open-ended studies are more powerful. They're not, okay? The biggest source of variation is cow. And what if for these genetic numbers, we needed like tens of thousands of cow records, okay? Cow is a big, big variable, okay? The other thing that I'll say is I like some of the things that Mike Allen and now Adam Locke's doing it, maybe Mike Vandehaar as well. This looking at the level of production of the cows before the treatment and then seeing how they respond to the treatment, because there are some really interesting interactions there. And of course, that's very important from a term of grouping, right? If you have high producing and low producing cows and they're going to respond differently to the diet. First of all, you'd like to have them in different pens, right? So you can actually see the different response, right? Well, I suppose you could follow the cows individually you couldn't follow their intake, but you could follow their production.
Yeah, that's where the high producing cows will produce more on a high starch diet. The low producing cows did the same thing, whether the diet was high in starch or high in high fiber byproduct feeds.
And some of that's level of production, some of that stage of lactation, it's hard to separate out.
Can I say one thing about you mentioned that cow is the biggest variable. Nutritionists don't do a very good job of using the information they have available to them from genomics. Because we could, instead of always using the first 2 weeks of milk production for a cow as your pre-treatment, and that's your covariate, and then you apply treatments and you see what happened. We could do more stuff where we started using what's the genomic prediction for milk production in this cow as our covariate in a model with different treatments.
Yeah, it certainly helps, but it's not as powerful.
No, it's not as good. It's not as good. But we often don't even try, and we really ought to.
A lot of people also misunderstand. You commonly heard this phrase that if you got a pound at peak, it's worth 200 for the lactation. So, you have to realize if you have two different treatments, right, and they're assigned to two different groups of cows in sort of a long-term study, you might get a significant difference, and maybe you got 4 pounds different at peak, right? Well, you got a significant difference, and there was a 4-pound difference in the groups, but maybe 2 pounds of that was due to the treatment, and 2 pounds was random. Okay, you never know, right? You could have a 6-pound treatment response and a -2 pound random response, right? So, but some of that difference is random, And that random difference is going to persist for the whole lactation, right? Whether you give them a treatment or not, right? So, nobody probably ever would do this, but just take two random groups of cows and split them, they're going to behave differently. Even if they have the same walking distance to the pen, or, the same pen size, same stall size, they just react differently just because random, and hundreds of cows is not enough to wipe out random. Cows are quite different from each other.
Gentlemen, has there been any key discussion areas we haven't covered yet that the audience needs to hear about?
I was going to say one thing earlier about the value of protein in the model. In the previous model, the only non-protein nitrogen was probably overvalued, especially if you look at some pasture-based systems where the grass is fertilized with a lot of nitrogen. You can get pretty high NPN levels in that grass. And in the previous model, they gave urea. Urea was a special feed. It got an energy value of 0. All other protein sources, regardless of how much NPN they had in them, we didn't worry about it. So when you look at a feed test lab gives you an energy value for a feed, it may have a lot of NPN in it, and it just predicts the energy value based on nitrogen, not worrying about whether it's true protein or not. With the new system, you'll be able to account for that.
I would like to say that this is a model, and it is not reality, right? The map is not the terrain. We use an awful lot of existing experimental data, okay, which by its nature is an empirical and more of an associative than a causative, okay? There are a lot of causative things that clearly have happened in individual experiments, okay, that are not included in the model, okay? They just don't show up in the general associations for one reason or another, okay? So people, and I think the chapters discuss, I know the fat chapter does, and I think the carbohydrate chapter does. I mean, it talks about critical experiments and things that people have seen. They've really seen this. This really happened in the experiment. That's why they do statistics. And every time you're on a farm, it's your own little experiment, right? So when we do meta-analysis, we always put study in there, right? Study's got to be treated as a random variable. It takes out a lot of noise, okay? But guess what? When you go back to the farm, it's like you're another study. So all the noise is added back in again, okay? So I would always go into a farm. I think the model's very usable. It's very understandable. It captures broad strokes, and then the parameters come from real world data where we have, measurements, right? It's where these things were measured, and the treatments that applied were, whatever funding source the person had to work with, right? Or whatever, right? It wasn't necessarily your farm or a random selection of farms in the US or a random selection of farms in the upper Midwest where a lot of the data comes from. So this is where, Mike Allen's written these several papers called Minds Over Models. And I think this is where you just need to be aware, there's thumb rules and they're great. Okay. Thumb rules are there to design to keep you out of trouble. Right. But the flip side of thumb rules is conventional wisdom. And, conventional wisdom, some people say that's CW. I say usually it's BS. Okay. A lot of times it's just flat wrong. Okay. And, one example I could point out to is, if we look at total fat in milk, we come up with this one story. It's not true. Okay. Clearly not true if we look at the individual short-term, long-term fat. So people need to be able to think out of the box. Okay. The model is another kind of box. Okay. It's a good box, but it's a box. And listen to the cows. Terry Howard always told me, listen to the cows. They don't lie. Okay. And, I'm going to say there's one other thing in the whole energy carbohydrate section. I think that was a tension in the committee, and I think there's a tension in the industry. And that is, are we inducing acidosis, right? We see if the black and white cattle come in and they have a lot of liver abscesses, does that mean our herds are routinely acidotic? I think those of us who measured pH on cows that we think are reasonably healthy, right, in our university herds, we are pH 5.5. We don't go, we go, yeah, that's kind of what you expect her to be, a couple hours after she ate a big meal. And so I don't know if the people who get a lot of milk out of cows are just the ones who manage to feed a diet that may be nutritionally acidotic, but somehow all their other management comes in and they can, surf on that edge and go really fast for a long time. And then other people find they have to back off because they can't manage it. I don't know the answer to that. Okay. But I always talk about when you're feeding carbohydrates here, to get more energy in a cow, that energy comes in the form of volatile fatty acids, and volatile fatty acids are acids. Okay. They have a pK of 4.8. They're acidic. So it's impossible to have a lot of energy going into a cow without having a high concentration of volatile fatty acids in the rumen. Just like it's impossible to optimize microbial protein production without having a level of ammonia that's going to spill over into the urine, right? There's just innate inefficiencies there that if you want to operate, full speed, then you have to live with some inefficiencies. And ultimately, they're not inefficient because high production, dilutes out maintenance so much that dilutes out your fixed costs, that in fact it is economically and biologically efficient to go to these high levels. But
all right. And with that, Stephanie has called last call. So what I'd like to do is ask each of you to kind of give us, one or two key takeaway messages for our audience. And Glenn, why don't we start with you?
Well, I still think that the fatty acid discussion is going to be something that a lot of nutritionists are going to have to bone up on, and there's going to be a lot of new stuff on that. The other one I think that is, I don't know, I think it's going to become more important is this whole, ecology thing, right? The methane and reduction in methanogenesis, and, that somehow in some way, some shape, some form, I think will push us towards better understanding of the impact of specific fatty acids on methane production in the rumen. I don't know what that looks like, but I think there'll be a lot of interest in that. Clearly, in many states already, there's concern about the levels of methane production, and there'll be some efforts to utilize some of that information to maybe help.
Yeah, interesting that we really downplayed the effect of fat on NDF digestion, yet it's having a major effect on methane production, right? Mm-hmm. That's kind of interesting, right? It's maybe that's because it does it on protozoa. I don't know, right?
Yeah, you brought that up earlier, Lou, and I thought that was a good point.
And if it decreases the protozoa, what's it doing to choline flow? So all those things are. I'll put a little plug in there for Balchem, but and I think the other thing that's going to be hard. This is the energy fat discussion, but people wrapping their mind around the amino acid balancing is going to be a real educational opportunity, I think, for people too. So I think the energy chapter, honestly, is just so much more straightforward and simpler and easier to understand that it's actually going to be a relief.
Look forward to reading it.
Yeah, it's. I didn't really realize Mike was that good a writer, but it's actually really quite good.
I did have help from Bill. I just got to point that out.
Bill's a fantastic editor.
Bill kept cutting stuff.
But I, mostly chalk up the success of the energy chapter to the fact that Mike and I have been discussing it for so long that, he finally learned stuff.
I'm sure in the end, Lou does deserve almost all the credit for it, probably.
Right. I think that was obvious anyway, but
yeah.
No, it really shows that Mike had taken the previous NRC and incorporated it into Spartan. Okay. That kind of nuts and bolts dealing with the model and at the same time dealing with reality, it really showed. A very good job on the energy chapter, Mike.
Oh, thanks. My last comment would be is, even though we think it's an improvement, I agree with what Lou said. Don't just trust the model. You gotta watch the cows, and when you make a diet change, try to figure out what they're telling you. Sometimes it's hard to measure, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't try. Watch the milk production, watch milk composition, watch intake, watch body condition score. Whatever you can measure is going to be helpful, but watch the cows.
And just realize we have not been playing with a functioning model for 10 years, okay? We've been playing with a functioning model for about a month and a half,
Yeah.
okay? So if you see something, say something. That's what I would say, because there's bound to be mistakes in there, and I think NRSP 9 will do a good job of fixing things that are just plumb wrong, right? And then identifying things that need to be improved.
So both Mark Hannigan and I are on NRSP 9, and we'll be looking at, if we see things that just seem like they need to be fixed soon, we'll be able to do that. Not, of course, to the official NASM, but we can change the software if we need to. So, and it'll be some sort of revision of the NASM software.
And NRSP 9 is separate from the National Academy, but they'll be sort of hosting this. And they made some improvements in the last software. For example, I think it was written to run on DOS or something like that. And they made it so it would work in Windows 10. So that's absolutely essential that somebody's there writing gun on this, and there's a place to put, I wouldn't call them complaints, but observations.
Yeah. Lou, any final comments? You want to put a bow on this for us?
Just, as good as the energy chapter is, the fat chapter is clearly better. But other than that,
that's a shocker.
And again, Mike really does talk with his hands a lot, which I find very.
Yeah.
No,
well,
I appreciate Balchem doing this. It was fun, and I appreciate your comments, Glenn. It was very useful.
Yeah, a lot of fun, and I want to thank you, gentlemen. This has been long awaited, but it certainly did not disappoint. Also want to thank our loyal listeners for stopping by at the Exchange once again, and hopefully you heard something new and maybe something you can even take back to the farm to help your customers. As a reminder, we continue breaking down the new 2021 8th revised edition of the Dairy NRC over the next coming weeks. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of the new episodes. If you'd like to pre-order a copy and receive a 25% discount, visit balchem.com/realscience and click on the NRC series for a link and the discount code. If you like what you heard tonight, please remember to hit the 5-star rating on your way out. And don't forget to request your Real Science Exchange t-shirt. Just like or subscribe to the Real Science Exchange. Send us a screenshot along with your address and shirt size to anh.marketing@balchem.com. Our Real Science Lecture series of webinars continues with the ruminant-focused topics on the first Tuesday of every month. Visit balchem.com/realscience to see upcoming events and past topics. We hope to see you next time here at the Real Science Exchange, where it's always happy hour and you're always among friends.
And where's my bottle of scotch?